And pass it over to our committee chair for the beginning of the Audiology Practice Committee meeting.
Okay.
This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me well. We are going to start today's meetings with the Audiology Practice Committee meeting. There are only 2 members on this committee at this time, so I'd like to acknowledge that Karen Chang is on the call and myself are the 2 members so far. We have vacancies. So Karen, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to remind the other board members that when we are holding a subcommittee, a practice committee, whether it's audiology, speech pathology, or hearing aid dispensing, only the members of the committee can participate in that meeting. So if the rest of you could hold your comments or questions until later, that would be great. Okay, I would like to ask if there are any public comments not on the agenda. We can't discuss those, of course, but we'd happy to hear about them so we can log in any issues you'd like to discuss at a later time. Can we ask for any public comment at this time?
All right, this is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment for items not on the agenda, please click that icon with a question mark within a square located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. Currently sharing instructions on the screen for your reference, and in the Ask field, typically in the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, please type, "I would like to make a public comment," and send to all panelists. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, this is the moderator, and it appears there are no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please.
All right, the Q&A panel is now closed.
Thank you. Okay, the item number 3, or AU3, under that tab in our book, is a further discussion and possible action regarding audiology licensing requirements related to the supervised clinical professional experience, as we've talked about for the last several board meetings. Just to give you a little background, as you can see on the first page behind that tab, is that Business and Professions Code section 2532-25B2 requires the submission of evidence of no less than 12 months of satisfactory completed supervised professional full-time experience or part-time. Another critical aspect of that definition is that the RPE shall follow completion of didactic and clinical rotation requirements of the audiology doctoral program. So that means that the hours have to be gained after you've completed all the didactic portions. And what we've learned over the last year or two from talking to representatives, faculty, and administrators of California's AUD programs is that that requirement is prohibited for the students in these programs in terms of finishing their programs, which ultimately is a consumer protection issue because there are access issues in California in terms of getting audiologic care from audiologists. So we've begun to work on statutory and regulatory changes to address that issue. In our November 2020 board meeting, the board did approve a 2021 legislative proposal that you'll see at the bottom of the page. Primarily the change is on the second page, where you can see that we're saying that the experience shall be completed under the direction of the board-approved audiology doctoral program, and on this portion in blue is the new language, and may be obtained by participation in supervised clinical rotations or experiences that are held throughout the duration of the program and during the required professional experience. Acceptable types of clinical rotations or experiences shall be defined by the board through regulation. So what we are hoping to accomplish today is, if you look down mid-page, you'll see a number of issues that I would like to engage anybody who has an opinion about this from the public members about what types of experiences or early rotations would we find acceptable? What are the logistics of those, supervisory requirements, and so on? If you look down the list under the paragraph that starts, this legislative proposal will now be included as part of the board's sunset review process, which is the plan at this point. But we have to develop the regulatory language which will accompany this legislation or be implemented along with it. So you can see under that, or what types of clinical rotations can be counted. Should they be counted depending on how much supervision they get? Should these experiences only be allowed in the second or third program year? Should there be any limitations or caps for certain types of hours? Or should we leave that up to the directors of the programs? What types of clock hours will we count? Only face-to-face patient contact hours, shift hours, audiology simulation hours, and there's a number of different ways to achieve this experience. Are there any considerations for students from out-of-state programs or students with federal visas that should be taken into account? And do students need to hold the RPE license when accruing pre-graduation hours? So those are the issues that we want to talk about today. So I would love to hear from any public members, especially people who are associated with AUD programs, in terms of what their thoughts are on those items I just mentioned on the second page.
Hi, Marcia. This is Karen. Do we have anybody that wants to speak on this?
I just looked at the list of attendees. Surprisingly, I don't see anybody from an AUD program.
Okay.
I don't believe. And I was hoping that they would be. Oh, I do see Jody Winselberg from San Jose is on the call. She might speak to that. The others, I'm not sure.
This is the moderator. Dr. Rajia, would you like me to open up the Q&A feature?
Yes, if you would, please.
Sure. All right. Q&A feature is now open for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment for this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. And I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to submit their requests. All right, it appears there are no requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, I guess so.
All right, the Q&A panel is now closed.
Well, I would speak a little bit about these issues myself. We have looked at many suggested elements in terms of answering this, in terms of what types of clinical rotation can be counted toward the 12 months as of satisfactory completed supervised professional full-time experience or part-time equivalent. We've heard from a number of these individuals, as I told you before, and apparently a lot of the programs, even starting in the first year, have clinical rotations in which the students are 100% over-the-shoulder supervised. And the thought is that they should be allowed to count those hours rather than waiting to include all of them during the RPE. But of course, we have to decide how many of those hours are going to count toward the required number of hours that that any program is going to ask, which is in the 1800 range, or 15 to 1800 range. So do we want to start from day one, so long as they are supervised 100%? And my instinct is yes, that's what I would prefer to do, is let them count all rotations prior up to approximately, I think we said 40%. That was a number that was thrown out. So clinical experiences or rotations prior to the RPE, perhaps we could talk about a 40% allowance of hours in those early clinical rotations. I would think they have to be 100% supervised over the shoulder, as I said. Some AUD programs in California are only 3 years long, so I don't think we can ask them to start in the third year, as one of the suggestions is offered on this page. I would say at least second year is where we should start. I wish there was somebody on here from one of the programs who could tell us a little bit more about their program in terms of when they actually start these rotations. Oh, I see, sorry. I see that Jody Winsenberg did raise her hand, it looks like, but we didn't call on her. I would like to hear from a program, so if she's willing to talk to us, can you open the public panel again?
Sure thing. I'll go ahead and open up the Q&A feature for public comment. And if any members of the public would like to make a public comment, please type the word comment in the text box and then click send to all panelists. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access that Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, and it looks like I do have a request from Jody Winselberg. And Jody, I'm going to request to unmute your microphone when the prompt comes up. Please click unmute me, and that'll unmute your microphone. So I am requesting to unmute right now.
There we go.
All right, Jody,
Hello?
you are unmuted.
Am I audible? Ah,
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. I apologize. I didn't have the process down. Thank you, Marcia, for recognizing that I was on the call, and I appreciate you asking for comments. Thanks to the board for looking for comments from the AUD programs. I'm the Director of Clinical Education for San Jose State. We are a new program. We've just finished our first cohort. And I would agree with Dr. Raggio's previous comment about including supervised clinical activity for the use of counting those towards clock hours towards the RPE. Right now we have a new program, so we're just starting our clinical program, but our intent was not to count shift hours for on-campus clinic, but to only count direct clinical clock hours, and those clock hours are supervised hours with direct patient contact. Once we are providing some more clinical activities, there may be associated practices that are associated with direct clinic patient care, like maybe the ordering of equipment, which under the supervision of the clinical supervisor on the on-campus might also be counted, but we are not looking to count shift hours until the student is out in the community on a rotation of an internship. Marcia, were there other things? I honestly can't see the list you were speaking to on my view, so I'm happy to speak to anything else that you might want to have a comment on.
Okay, thank you. I would like your opinion on a few things. Let me just verify what you said. In terms of counting the clock hours, you have rotations in your program early on, and they are 100% supervised. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Clinical clock hours. The sim hours are also supervised. The lab hours may not be supervised.
Do you start any kind of rotations in the first year?
We don't, not external rotations, but clinical rotations will start in the spring of year one in the campus, on the campus clinic.
Okay, so the second semester
yeah,
start for that. Okay. Now look at the list I'm looking at. Hopefully it's in the board materials on the board's webpage if you want to find these, but should there be any limitations? I mean, what do you think of 40% of these early rotations being counted toward the RPE hours, or any other number that strikes you?
Yeah, I want to just recognize that if you have 3 students in an audio booth with a supervisor, the only person getting the clinical clock hours is the student actually performing the test. So
Yes.
I'm not sure why we would limit the amount of percent of if it's 100% supervised. I'm not sure what the thought process is behind that, but I'm willing to have that discussion. But I would be inclined to say that if the student is participating in direct patient contact and that's being supervised by a licensed audiologist in the clinic setting, I don't understand why that would be any different than 100% supervision in an outside clinical setting.
I can only tell you that earlier discussions with faculty of other AUD programs were adamant that the real training happens once you have all the didactics under your belt and you go out for that 3rd or 4th year externship. That's solid, what we used to call a CF, is where most of the clinical learning occurs. So they weren't very happy about accepting these early rotations because they thought, it isn't as good a learning experience as this solid block of time later on. So in deference to those notions that may be the case, and there were many who felt that way, that we would just allow, even if it's 100% supervised, a limited percentage of pre-RPE rotations to count. That's where that came from. We can continue to discuss that, but that's where it came from.
Okay. No, thanks for that background information. As you know, I'm new to this program. This is a brand new program, so I might not be fully aware of all the comments previously. I can tell you that the clinical directors of all the AUD programs meet on a regular basis and discuss best practice and try to align our practices so that there is alignment throughout the state of California with the AUD programs. I think that previously, Marcia, and I could be mistaken, but I think that previously some of the programs might have been counting shift hours in the on-campus clinical training, and that was what some of the other programs were taking objection to or questioning, because there may have been some things that were going on during their assignment to the clinic that were not construed as direct patient contact hours. I defer to your knowledge of what happened previously. I would say that if somebody was seeing a patient and they saw that patient for a full hour under direct supervision, they should be able to get that clock hour because they are receiving that same direct precepting tutorial they would as if they were in the community. But unfortunately, I don't think the rest of my colleagues are on this call, so we can't go back and see who might have objections to that.
Okay, well, that's okay. We want to take in all opinions about it before we start working on any kind of regulatory language about this. So I'm glad you're here. The other thing is I've talked to a number of folks from other states who do allow a audiology simulation techniques to count as clock hours. So they'll have models, for example, that they can use for a number of different things, from taking ear impressions to doing real ear measurements and so on, just for practice, so to speak. Some people wanted to count those hours. Do you have a thought about that?
I think our collective thought on that is that's either simulation or lab, depending upon whether or not there's an actual simulation of an actual audiologic procedure, i.e. we have an electronic simulation that we were so grateful to have during COVID that allowed our students who were basically banished from any kind of patient contact to do, for example, case histories, air, bone, speech, masking, counseling, all electronically that then they could be reviewed by the course instructor. We counted those as sim hours with the recognition that sim hours are part of the RPE and clinical clock hour requirements for licensure and certification. And I don't strongly feel that sim hours and clock hours, it depends on your definition of clock hours, right? Because there should be sim hours, a portion of clock hours should be allowable by simulation. So I'm not sure if you're saying simulation. I guess you have to restate what you're proposing. I would say simulation is a clock hour but there's a limited amount of simulation that can be counted towards actual clock hours.
What do you think about hours that some, and including Ash's comments about it, are that any kind of work that a student does that an audiologist would do on a daily basis should count, from writing reports to calling hearing aid manufacturers to writing letters, making calls to physicians, whatever it is they have to do that's kind of patient support should be counted. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would agree with that once they're placed externally, because then they're actually in a practice and functioning in a practice, and they're not in a university setting where the focus is really didactic instruction, even though you are providing clinical care to real people. So that's the term, that those items is what I would consider shift time. And I think we are counting shift time once they go outside of the clinic, because everything that audiologists is doing in their practice, which is related to a patient in direct patient care. I'm not talking about, cleaning the, if they're in the clinic and they're cleaning up or they're doing stuff like that on campus, that's not in relation to patient care. But if they're outside and they're filling out ear mold forms and ordering hearing aids, and writing reports, that's in relation directly to the care of that patient and should be counted.
Okay. So you've answered most things on this list. I don't know if anybody else has joined now that might be able to help us as well. The last two items, it says, are there any considerations for students from out-of-state programs or students with federal visas that should be taken into account? The only thing I know about is the federal visa problem is they're only allowed 11 months in the program, and they were unable to complete the 12-month problem. That's the only issue I've heard about. I don't know if anybody else is aware of problems that occur due to out of state, unless Paul Sanchez or Sharice Burns can talk to it from a licensing perspective, what that's asking.
I had heard about that as well. One of the participants in our clinical directors group was actually in that same situation, but was able to complete a 12-month. It's really a matter of, because of the timing, then they have a limited amount of time to then apply for a job if they want to stay here. I think originally when you spoke, I don't remember exactly the board meeting, but I believe several of my colleagues voiced an opinion that we did want to keep the time and clock hours as part of the RPE requirement, but we were willing to look at 11 months versus 12 months. But that was because we were giving a nod to some of the international federal visa students who were saying that was cumbersome for them to then complete it and then look for a job within that specific period of time and get licensure and everything else.
Okay.
And
Thanks for
Dr.
that.
Raju,
Yes.
this is Sharice Burns. I think what we have heard is more on the federal visa issue that you were just speaking of. However, we did recently hear of a Texas program that only does 1,500 hours, something like that, and then one that it no longer has the externship as part of the program. So now there is a person that is kind of stuck in limbo and needs to find a program here that will let them in so that they can do their externship, because they didn't. There's some new program, I guess, that doesn't include the externship under the program, so they're already out.
Yeah, there are some.
So, and of course, ours has the it must be obtained under the direction of a board-approved audiology doctoral program. So that's kind of where that person got stuck.
I see. That is a conundrum for them, I'm sure. I'm just wondering, Sharice, can you speak to what happens when you have an out-of-state applicant who has completed whatever their current state requirement or program requirements? Let's say it's 1,400 hours and they come to California and want to practice here. How do we look at that shortage if we do indeed ultimately have language that says 1,850? Does that matter?
It would. Right now it's the 12 months, so we usually recommend that they accrue more hours, and I believe we recommend that they find another program that might be able to take them finish those additional hours. Right now during COVID, we're pretty lenient on the 12-month, but it is the 12 months. So we try to work with everybody as much as we can and help them as much as possible. But yeah, and I believe we went away from the 1,800 hours because people liked the month requirement, just so that the externship was a true externship, but allow them to count some of the earlier experiences.
Okay, well, that's certainly something we need to continue the discussion on in terms of how many hours, because it was kind of, some people were fine with the kind of national standard of 1,850 or so, and actually already have that built into their program. So, but let's keep talking about that particular issue. So, Jody, can I ask you if someone came from out of state and said, I'm lacking, some months or some hours, would your program take in somebody like that for a short period of time? You haven't probably come across that yet, but are you still there?
I apologize. It looks like Jody muted her microphone, so I have to request to unmute her again.
Okay.
So one moment, Jody, while I request to unmute you, please click that unmute me when the prompt comes up.
I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I muted my headset because I was coughing. I apologize, and then I got totally unmuted. I really can't speak to that, Marcia. It is certainly something I can take back to the faculty and request. We're such a new program. We've never had that experience. What you're suggesting is, would we take someone in on a limited time to perhaps place them clinically, like as a just to come in just for hours into the program? Is that what you're, if I heard you correctly?
Well, and or time. Let's say they
Okay.
haven't completed a 12-month, it's much less than that. From out
So
of
you mean
state.
to facilitate somebody to complete their externship through our program? Is that's?
Yes, you could say it that way. We would assume that in their home state, they've met all the requirements for completing it there, but it just doesn't meet California standards. And presumably they do need to do that.
So that's obviously, I'm not the director or chair of the program, and that requires admissions changes, and so I'm not able to speak to that, but it's certainly a question I can bring back to the faculty to see if that is possible within the CSU system. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, that'd be great if you could get any feedback about that.
Yep, happy to.
The last issue that is on this list that we should address is currently the RPE students, as I understand it, are licensed they have kind of an interim license. I believe that's the case. And would we need students in these pre-graduation or early rotations to also be licensed or have some sort of preliminary license? There aren't either you, Charisse, have any thoughts about that?
It hasn't come up in our conversation. Personally, I would think that in the early rotations, there's at least within the first and second year, there's 100% pretty much supervision. And that's also based on the skill level of the student. But yeah, I don't know that it's a question I would want to pose to the rest of the group.
Yeah, Charisse, are you still on? Do you have any?
I am. Absolutely. And I think preliminarily, I would think that what we would want to consider for public consumer protection is that level of supervision that, again, these earlier hours are much more heavily scrutinized. They're more heavily supervised. They are, I think, I can't remember which participant last time talked about it, but they were a training program director, and they were stating that, yeah, those earlier hours are much more heavily scrutinized and supervised than the externship hours, which they try to ensure are really great, but they're not always so certain. So that aspect does seem to reduce the consumer protection concern about those earlier hours because of that. But I think it's definitely worth talking about more, and encouraging a few more AUD programs to join Jody in our meeting and our discussion so that we can definitely pin it down. Because it does sound like those early hours are, they're very supervised over the shoulder. It's not even just in the building. So,
Charisse, I would agree exactly with what you're saying. That's our intention in the San Jose program, and I wouldn't want to have the students, preliminarily licensed until they're actually in their RPE.
and there would be that other consideration that the RPE is meant to be just for the one experience. So again, it's a license that's a year essentially, or a school year. So there would be those issues, and that would increase the number of times they would need to extend or something like that, potentially.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought there was an early suggestion of getting rid of the RPE license requirement altogether. Can somebody refresh my memory about that discussion, especially if Paul was involved in that?
I remember one person mentioning it, but then the rest of the group kind of talked about that there's kind of more of a validity to having a temporary license, and it's a good transition to the permanent. That's what I remember them talking about, that they would prefer that the RPE stay with at least the externship portion. But that's just my recollection.
And I would agree with that, Charisse, because as you said previously, that we don't have as much control once the students go out to an externship on exactly what happens on a day-to-day basis. So that consumer protection of having a temporary license kind of helps provide some reassurance that there is oversight, because we don't have direct oversight like we do for the internships or on-campus clinical work.
Absolutely. Allows us to take in complaints against it as well. So.
Okay, I think I have a sense of some of the thoughts, at least of one program, for the issues that we have to look at to develop the regulatory language. So just to, we can't make any decisions today. We don't have a quorum for this committee, but what we can do is put together our kind of a list of issues that we want to go forward with exploring further. And to summarize those is to determine if there should be, and if so, what percentage of the total number of clock hours that a program requires can be achieved in the early rotations. Secondly, we have to determine whether we want to have a stipulation regarding months only, or we want hours and months in the whole picture. We have to decide that issue. It looks like so long as they're getting 100% supervision, even with the earliest on-campus site, because some programs do early and intensive on-campus clinics, that those should be considered in the collection of hours. But we need to ask a few more people about whether it should start with second year, second semester, how do they feel about that? It looks like 100% supervision is required. I know in the RP itself, typically the supervision wanes as people get more and more competent. So again, we have to look at any kind of consideration like that. It looks like some programs would accept a percentage, perhaps 10%, I've heard in the past, of any kind of shift hours or simulation work. So we have to address that idea, especially during COVID or the difficulties seeing face-to-face patients, that some of that might be helpful to students and thus prepare them well, so long as they're supervised, to use some of those hours as well. It looks as though also on the last point that licensing people in the early rotations may not be necessary, but once they're in that greater portion of the RPE experience, that the preliminary license or pre-license, I'm sorry, I don't know what you call it, should be implemented or continue to be implemented. So I would like to say that I'd like to take those issues with what we've learned today back to the staff to write up those potential regulatory features and bring it back to our sunset review as well as the next board meeting.
Hi, this is Karen. Marsha, can I make one comment real quick?
Yes, please.
Do we have contact information or emails of the other directors and whatnot of all the other CSU programs?
We do. And normally I not had to remind them to be on this call. They just were because they were interested in this topic. So I'm not sure that they got the word adequately. So we definitely need to invite them specifically.
Yeah, I was wondering, would it be possible to send these questions out to them, and then they could, you know, if they want to or not, if they want to have an opinion, write up something so that we can see it?
I think that is a good idea, and presumably we can do something like that. We've certainly asked we've asked questions of that sort in the past of these individuals. Charisse, do you see any problem with doing that?
No, not at all. And we could even send it out as a survey so that they can tell us who they are, what program they are, the position they have, and then kind of make comments on all of those and then collect it all.
Yeah, I think that'll be great, because that way we can see it all in one setting, and then maybe they just couldn't make it today, and maybe they won't be able to make it at the next board meeting. So that way we can see what's going on in each individual program.
May I comment?
Please.
Yeah, I actually was thinking along those same lines. I think that's an excellent idea. All of the clinical directors of education were aware, but most are on vacation. That's why I'm here. They were aware, but they're not able to attend because of vacation schedules. And so I think that having a collective voice through a survey where the licensing board can then get input from every single one of the programs is really the way to go if you want to make sure that you have inclusion and representation. And I think that would be welcomed by all of the programs and appreciated very much, given how difficult it is with schedules now with COVID. And we were allowed on campus, now we're off campus again on quarantine. So I think that would be wonderful. And I appreciate whoever made that comment. I think it's a great idea.
We did meet with many of the faculty, even some out-of-state folks who did answer many of these questions. So we actually have some data on that already. But to send out maybe a new survey, trying to kind of hone it down to these specific issues we're talking about, is a good idea. And I'd be happy to work with Charisse or whomever on the board to develop the survey questions. And then have the mechanism to send those out if it's
I agree, Marsha.
other than email.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I did see the previous conversations and questions and answers, but I think now you're getting very specific. So I think, as you said, it's important because this group of questions you just raised is a lot more specific than some of the information you gleaned earlier from your surveys previously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. And we do need the granular aspect of this to be understood. But our purview, of course, is not to help the programs become better or more efficient, other than their consumer protection issue related to that. So we have to really look at that, make sure that we keep that in mind when we ask these questions and they provide their comments, and we ultimately decide on the regulatory language if it meets our own needs in that regard. So I think, Charisse, were you okay with working with me to develop this survey?
Absolutely.
Okay, and then I don't know if you ever use something like, SurveyMonkey or any of those other electronic surveys rather than just sending it out paper and pencil email?
Absolutely. DCA, I believe, has a SurveyMonkey account that we can contact them, and once we have our questions, they can coordinate it and prepare it for us, and we'll get all the information.
Okay, great. So thank you, Karen, for that suggestion. It was a good one, and we will follow through with that. Are there any other board comments regarding this issue at this point?
No, I'm good.
Okay, I haven't seen anything. I don't see any hands up. Any hands up? Okay. Thank you, Karen, again. So I think we have some, Sharice mentioned that we are not really making decisions today, but rather gathering more information to take back to the full board at some point. But hopefully we have enough to begin writing up something. Do you agree, Sharice?
Absolutely. We have all the prior input and then today's input, and I think we can go ahead and just draft something so that there's kind of something on paper to consider at the next meeting. But in the interim, go ahead and get the additional written comment through the survey, so that can also help us in our development.
Okay, well, I'm gratified that this topic is moving along as well as it has. It does take a long time to do anything, but the board has already voted to accept the statutory language that you see in this report, and now this is our really first concrete step in trying to get the regulatory ideas in writing. So, is there any other public comment regarding this issue?
This is the moderator, and it appears there are no further requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you.
All right, the Q&A panel is now closed.
Okay, I think that concludes our discussion for AU3, or item 3, under the Audiology Practice Committee. I would like to move on to tab AU4, and the next agenda item for this committee is discussion and possible action regarding continuing professional development requirements for audiologists. Again, if I can draw your attention that to the background, which you can see under AU4, it says in November of 2015, the board approved revisions to the current CPD requirements. These revisions allow up to half of the CPD hours to be accrued through self-study courses. In May of 2016, the board reviewed the regulations again and made additional changes. And you can see those in your board materials here, what those changes were. As you know, the CPD requirements are designed to protect California consumers by ensuring that licensees continue to increase their professional knowledge, skills, and attitudes, and to maintain ethical and competent practices. And with all of that in mind, we're asking, should the Audiology Practice Committee review the definition of self-study as step 1 to ensure that going beyond the number of self-study hours previously approved by the board does not compromise consumer protection. So we're going to look at the definition of self-study. Is it still appropriate? And what kind of hours should we accept for self-study, or percentage of CPD or CEUs can be in self-study? So those are kind of two of the questions. And Karen is still with me
Here.
on this committee. So the current language says that that instead of the third or 25% time that self-study was allowed before, we have moved it to 50%. And our question is, should we get rid of that entirely and make any hours of self-study appropriate, as some boards have done? If you look, they put together, the staff put together a nice spreadsheet of different occupations. I see your hand up, Paul, in a minute. You can look to see what these other boards have done in terms of these hours. So I'd like to ask Paul Sanchez if you want to make a comment about it.
Yes, first of all, I'm struggling with my button here. I was actually trying to lower my hand because
Oh,
I had accidentally clicked on it. But, just as a reminder, we did actually promulgate regulations for the hearing aid dispensers that actually already made these changes and allow for 50% of their CE to be self-study.
okay.
I just wanted to add that. I was actually having a problem here with my button here, and I couldn't see that I was lowering it. So excuse me for that.
That's okay. That's all right. Okay, so the language has really already been accepted that it would be raised to 50%. So our question is do we want to
Dr.
stick with
Rasha?
that? Sorry.
Oh, would you like me to read the definition of self-study?
Okay, if we want to start with that issue, because that's how I kind of see there's two things. What is self-study? What constitutes that? And also what percentage of hours we're going to accept. So go ahead if you want to read self-study definition.
Sure, and this is the currently proposed changes to the regulations that were previously approved in 2016. So self-study means a form of systematic learning that does not offer participatory interaction between the licensee and the instructor during the instructional period. These include, but are not limited to, recorded courses delivered via the internet or CD-ROM/DVD, correspondence, or home study, and which require completing and passing an assessment or examination of the course content.
Okay, so that's a very different idea than going to a conference where you have the ability to participate in a Q&A, or there's some hands-on aspect of it. This is purely online with no interaction. I've personally never done a course like that, so I can't speak to it from personal experience in terms of how much I learned or how valuable that kind of learning is relative to more interactive experiences. I don't care if you have any experience with self-study.
I've had experiences with both. I would say self-study doesn't provide a genuine experience than live classes. However, with COVID, I actually feel like, how were conferences done this time around? Did you guys have conferences?
California Academy of Audiology did, and American Academy of Audiology did. They were both virtual.
They were both virtual, right? But that's not considered self-study. That's considered.
That's right. It's not
full hours. So, I personally would say, with internet technology these days, it's not really a barrier, because you could do a virtual conference and it's still considered live, kind of live, quote unquote live.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
right.
I guess this one is that we've increased the self-study by like 12 and 24 hours required.
So 50%, the way it's currently configured and accepted.
That's fine, but I know that I personally don't get much from just not having any interaction with anybody.
Yeah, I think there's many of us feel that way, and there's also the concern that you don't have to do much for self-study in terms of watching it, answering a few questions, done, and you don't learn very much that way. Although there are people who would say No, I learn a lot from self-study. I really concentrate. I sit there the whole time. I do the work, and I have learned a lot. So
Right.
I'd like to call on Paul Sanchez first to comment on this.
Thank you. I wanted to find out. I know that we've heard a lot from the speech language pathology community on this. I haven't heard very much from the audiology community, and I want to know if there was this demand. The previous board felt like limiting that self-study, or actually allowing more to a limit of up to 50%, was important because they wanted there to be that interactive learning that they thought was effective, as far as, you know, reaching the goals of continued professional development. But I was curious to find out from you, Dr. Rajo, if you have heard from the audiology community on this issue, and if they are looking to increase self-study.
I have a little bit, I should say. And again, kind of on the fence is the takeaway that I'm getting, that self-study in the right hands with the right person can be very helpful, useful for learning. But the general consensus, I believe, was that face-to-face, more hands-on, is preferable. We see people, our practice is face-to-face individuals. So the idea was to support learning in that way. And yes, you can sit in a chair at a conference and not pay attention and, you know, talk on your phone or you know, text message people and not learn a thing. That happens also. But my concern is that if we allow everything to be self-study, that people will wait until, you know, the last minute to do a bunch of courses and say, I'm done. And that's very common. And I think that is not a good consumer protection approach to CPD. I have another hand up, Joanne Slater.
All right, this is the moderator. Joanne, I'm going to request to unmute your microphone. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt comes up. All right, and now you are unmuted.
Hello, this is Joanne Slater, and I just have a response to a few of the comments that have been made so far. One of them has to do with in-person or live events being interactive, but the reality is that in a live, either in-person or virtual event, there could be a room full of several hundred people, and very few participants actually interact with the presenter or with materials. Most of the time, people are sitting and listening to the presentation, whether it's in person or virtual, which is no different from listening to the presentation if it's not delivered in real time. In reality, there is very little interaction with presenters at most conferences and large events. And you know, if you have a room full of 300 people, there's only an opportunity for a handful of them to ask actual questions in the time allotted for the event. The other thing that has not been considered is the availability of live events. Or live, whether it's online or in person, is that it requires the learner to take time away from their patients at a time that's not under their own control. They have to give up that time and attend and give up time with patients that they otherwise were not planning to give up. So the availability of synchronous learning activities where there is the opportunity for interaction with the presenter may limit what the different licensees are able to do. The other thing is that, you know, we've heard comments from a couple members of the board who said what their personal interest was and their personal preference was for learning, but I would just remind you that that's an N of 2, and that there are many other learners who have a different experience with online or other self-study materials where there is no opportunity for direct interaction in real time with the presenter. There are ways, even with self-study activities, to get that interaction with a presenter or with an authority, you know, if it's the CE provider, to get information about the course or any questions that happen as a result of the activity, even if it's not in real time. So there are opportunities to pursue interaction, even if it is not at a synchronous activity. And I just ask that the board consider that there are preferences of other learners, that it's a very individual preference as to what kind of learning means the most to an individual learner. Thank you.
Joanne, could I just ask, what's your professional affiliation?
Sure. I am an audiologist. I'm a doctor of audiology. I am the director of CE administration for Audiology Online and speechpathology.com, or for the company that owns those two learning spaces. And I'm also on the ASHA Continuing Education Board.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for your comments. Charisse, did you have a question or a comment?
I'll let Todd go before me.
Okay, Todd.
Well, actually, Joanne pretty much spoke to everything I was going to speak to, so thank you for stealing my thunder, Joanne.
Sorry.
I mean, I would agree that the reality is one thing we have to consider when we look at conferences is, speaking to what she said, there's a couple a year, you have to take vacation, you have to pay for the conference. There could be monetary barriers as well that we are imposing by requiring people to do that and basically funneling them into those particular those conferences. And I think that can create a barrier when it's so limited in time. And I would argue that, frankly, the virtual conferences that have been going on, excuse me, just this year, I don't honestly see how that is a bit of different from doing an online course where you're listening in real time to someone on a website, because you're getting about the same level of interaction.
I was just wanted to say, I think that board members are not allowed to participate in this, to make comments. Isn't that correct, Paul? Or Charisse?
Yes, that's my understanding, and
Well, I
I'll
snuck
ask our
one in,
legal
I'm sorry.
counsel if he could just kind of clarify that for us.
Yeah. Yes. So any of the practice committees, the subcommittees, only the members of the committee can participate in the discussion.
I apologize then for participating. My bad.
That's okay. And and I didn't say anything, but I do appreciate your comments in any case. Charisse, you have your hand up. Do you want to say something?
I do actually. So a couple things. To first start off, I will just go ahead and give my own personal experience in that I used to be the manager over a CE auditor for my previous board. And oftentimes we do need to worry about consumer protection, only in the fact that sometimes we do have those actors that are completing all or 75% of their CE or CPD as online learning in the last 24 hours before they renewed. And that does beg the question of how much they have learned in that period if they're running through their CE that quickly, and just kind of trying to get through it like traffic school or something. But outside of that, I can see what Joanne's and Todd's emphasis is, and it actually goes right back to that definition of self-study, where I think maybe what we should be talking about is more of the definitions and talking about interaction and participatory interaction. And one thing to point out is that our current language, or the language we're changing, used to have instructor and or other course participants, and we might want to add back and or other course participants so that it's participation between the instructor and or course participants, so that way both of those count. And that currently, if interaction's allowed between the participants and the instructor, it always counts as live right now. And so maybe part of the definition is also whether or not synchronous versus asynchronous participation should be allowed, and if that allows a broader range of virtual learning that's still participatory, but that may not be synchronous. So that was just something I was hearing.
Okay, so I don't know if plan to make any decisions today or recommendations. the 50% has already been accepted by the board. Correct?
Yes.
That is correct.
Yeah. So it's really a matter of, do we want to change self-study to be anything other than as it's currently defined, where it's not a non-interactive experience. Karen, I don't know if you have a thought about this as a committee member about whether we should lower or change that standards, change that language so that self-study could be any interactive virtual experience, and everything else is face-to-face and live.
When you say self-study, any interactive virtual experience, that doesn't include live virtual experience like we're doing right now? This is right.
That's correct. At this point, it doesn't include that. It's purely between you and your computer.
I think that's fine. Yeah.
To keep that definition.
So to keep this definition that I see in blue.
Yeah,
I'm on page 1 of 6, yeah. The self-study definition.
Yes, and that's what Sharice read to us earlier.
Yeah, CD1 person.
So you're okay with leaving the definition of self-study as it is, and not start to break down some of those corners and include more synchronous interaction?
Well, the synchronous interaction would be considered live study, right?
It would, and that's the point. Are we trying to broaden the definition to include any virtual?
So, because right now it's 50-50, the live and then self-study, it's 50-50 right now, correct? So then virtual would be considered, like right now what we're doing would be considered live. Yes. And then self-study would be another 50%, that's 50%. Yeah, because you know what? The problem is that with COVID, I just don't know if anybody's going to be able to go into a live, like face-to-face conference room.
Well, actually, the California Academy of Audiology is holding their face-to-face conference in September, I believe.
And, oh, really?
Yes, but they're sending out cautionary emails that you have to show evidence of a vaccination or a negative test within 72 hours of the day you come into the conference. And of course, they're doing everything up on site to sanitize everything and so on. But they are.
Oh, okay.
After holding it virtually last year.
Uh-huh.
I believe the American Academy is also planning their next conference in St. Louis in the spring, also face-to-face.
Are they, when they do face-to-face, are they also going to have like a live feed?
I'm not sure that they do. They might. I see Carrie Bauer. Let me finish with Karen here, and then we'll go to more public comment. I don't know the answer to that for sure. Whether somebody can join that way virtually if they choose to. They may make it some sort of hybrid offering, but I don't know that for sure. So you're okay with keeping it at self-study definition as is, with not including any additional quote-unquote live or interactive work, and the 50% seems as a consumer protection issue if you believe that face-to-face has some merits that are not shared by the self-study.
Yeah, I think I prefer live. However, honestly, with COVID, some people might just not feel comfortable going to a live conference.
Okay.
You know, so with I also don't want to make it prohibitive for people to complete their continuing education.
Yes, no, I understand and appreciate that too. Paul, did you want to comment?
Yes, can we just clarify, because we're using terms live and face-to-face, when we're talking about what's available right now, especially during the time, during this pandemic. I presented at conferences and they have been online, they've been live, and there has been interaction. So I just want to confirm that when we say face-to-face, what we're talking about, because right now the question is self-study, which would be based on the definition. And I think it could be confusing if we're talking about face-to-face versus live interactive online.
I equate live face-to-face similar to live interactive online. And then stuff via internet is just kind of like the sexual harassment training that we have to do.
Yes.
I just do it on my own time. I could do it in the middle of the night, answer a few questions, and then I'm done.
Yes, I see that just as you do, Karen. Charisse, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think a clear way to reference it might be pre-recorded versus live, because live can be online or in person, but pre-recorded usually means there's zero interaction and that there's not a chat feature or any sort of interactive component of the online learning.
Then how about if we would we be able to change instead of delivered via the internet, would be pre-recorded delivered? Because you can have live interaction via the internet, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And the biggest thing on here is about the participation. So if it offers any participation with the instructor under the new definition, not the proposed definition, then it would count. Under the old definition, if it involves any participation between the participant and the instructor, or the participant and other participants, so maybe a chat feature on a pre-recorded, then it would also still be live because it offers participation between the participants. So technically speaking, it could be your pre-recorded learning, but if there is an interactive chat feature available and there's more than one participant, then that would be live. So that's the old definition. So right now in the currently proposed definition that was approved back in 2016, it only says and the instructor during the instructional period. So it has to be, so those caveats there where it says it does not offer participatory interaction between the licensee and the instructor during the instructional period. So while the learning is happening, there's no interaction with the instructor at that time. So that kind of is where Carrie Bowers or Dr. Bowers' comment kind of clued me into the fact that we also aren't even looking at the asynchronous versus synchronous learning opportunities here. And then also that our proposed one has instructor, but it doesn't include course participants. So allowing a chat feature between participants would not count as live under this new definition. So that's something we might want to look at as well.
Okay. If there isn't any further board comment, I would like to open the floor for public comment, because I see a couple of hands up for the public.
All right, this is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access that Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, we have a request from Carrie Bauer first. So I will go ahead and request to unmute. Can you please click the unmute me when the prompt comes up? All right, Carrie, you are unmuted.
Thank you. I am a doctor of audiology and the CAA president this year. I just wanted to clarify that CAA conference will be held face-to-face only. It was extremely cost prohibitive to do a virtual and face-to-face conference, and we just couldn't make that work.
Carrie, since we have you, would you like to offer any thoughts about the 50% idea or the definition of self-study? Do you have any comments about, well, mostly I want to know, how does CAA feel about being able to be interactive versus self-study and this 50-50 configuration as we have it now? Is there any plus you can see to keeping it that way or not?
Well, the legislative committee did meet the other evening and discuss this topic. And I think that the general consensus was that CAA can provide learning opportunities either virtually or in person, face-to-face, or live, depending on what way the board chooses to go with the CEU CPD requirements. I think that the kind of overall arcing question was if whether or not our requirements were in line with other professional boards, and why the regulations were so specific for audiologists in comparison to medical doctors, occupational therapists, physical therapists. But CAA as a board can provide educational opportunities either way. I think that what you have just said about pre-recorded versus live or virtual conferences, I think that that's all fine. I think the definition makes total sense.
So did the group have any thoughts about personally whether they learn better in a interactive environment than they do in self-study?
I think that again, the overall consensus was very similar to what Dr. Slater said, in that people have a wide variety of personal preferences. Some people learn much better at an in-person event where they are forced to participate. I know I don't personally. I attend many conferences where I tune out and sit in the back and don't pay attention. I can do the same thing virtually. I think it all depends on your professional ethics and being interested in the material that's being presented, and being dedicated to your profession. And I don't know that that can be mandated based on CEU requirements. I think that at some point you have to have some personal ethics and professional ethics there, and we have to rely on that. I know that there are, like you've spoken about, I know that there are a vast number of people who get their CEUs at the last minute, do a lot of them virtually. Again, I don't know that that means that they're not learning them. If they choose to do those at the last minute, they may still be getting the same information as someone who does it spread out over the year and does a couple of virtual, pre-recorded talks throughout the year. So I think it really is just a personal preference, and several members of the board that met said that they felt better learning in person. Several members said that they felt better doing kind of independent study. So I think you're just going to have a huge variety of people.
Okay, thank you. Is there other public comment?
This is the moderator. We have a request for comment from Joanne Slater. Joanne, when I'm going to request to unmute your microphone, when the prompt comes up, please click unmute me.
Hello, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak again. I wanted to talk about a couple of things. One, regarding the definition of self-study, I would urge the board to continue to align their definition of self-study with what is used in most, it's used publicly by the Department of Education and other educational institutions, where synchronous activities allow the ability for the interaction with the presenter in real time, either virtually or in person, versus asynchronous learning, which does not allow that opportunity. I think just using those terms or keeping them clear in your definitions will allow you to align, for example, with how ASHA requires CE providers to register their courses as well. It's either synchronous or asynchronous. It allows interaction with the presenter online or in person, or it doesn't. The other thing, in terms of something that I believe it was Jody who just said, you know, when people need to find topics that interest them, if they're required to attend live events and they've got the budget to attend one live conference and there's 10 hours and maybe one or two of them is on a topic that you're really interested in, you're attending a live event, but you're not getting the CEUs in the area that is most pertinent to your area of practice. And by allowing a number of those CEUs to be earned, or a greater percentage, 50% or whatever percent you decide on, you're giving people the opportunity to earn the CEUs in the area where it has the opportunity to make the most difference for what they do in their daily practice. The other thing is regarding the number of CEUs that are allowed through self-study versus or asynchronous versus synchronous activities. I would also urge the board to take a look at what other boards are doing. 50% requirement for synchronous activities is more stringent than pretty much any other SLP or audiology board out there, and more stringent than most other licensing boards in allied health professions. It's still better than the current allowance of, I think it's a quarter can be earned through self-study now, but 50% is better. But I would urge the board to look at data rather than just deciding on kind of at the draw of a card, or, you know, let's just up it to 50%. Look at what the data is out there. You know, even the ASHA CCCs, you're required to earn 30 hours every 3 years. There's no requirement that any percentage of those need to be earned through synchronous activities, and there's no restriction that so many can't be earned, you know, in the last month of the 3-year period. There's just no regulation over that. You know, if you're going to a live conference, it's an 8-hour conference, you're sitting there and getting 8 hours in one day. How much can you absorb in one day anyway? You know, but again, if you put that requirement that so many hours have to be earned in a synchronous activity, and so people have their budget and they go to an 8-hour conference, again, you're forcing them to learn in a way that may not be most conducive to actual learning. Thank you.
Thank you. Someone else?
This is the moderator. I have a hand raised from an attendee identified as Michelle. Although I don't see an audio connection, but I do see another attendee with the same name of an audio connection. So I'm going to try to unmute that line. So Michelle, I'm going to request to unmute you. Please click the unmute me button when it prompts on your screen.
Hello, this is Michelle Linares. I'm the chair for the California Speech and Hearing Association, and I really value everybody's input. I just want to offer something and some of the experiences that we've learned. When we're talking about learners, there seems to be this myopic view, or maybe a generational view for preference, right? I know, like for me, I'm mid-stage in my career, and the way that I learned, you know, was in a classroom, auditorily, looking at a board, scribbling notes that maybe I would never look over again, but I would recall, right? My children, who are much younger, much like the graduate students that I see, have been able to learn in different ways. And not just that, at different stages in your life. I don't think that I remember being a young mother, you know, watching something in the middle of the night with gratitude that I finished breastfeeding, and I could just listen and read in the silence of my home and really take something in that I enjoyed. You know, I think the other thing that bothers me about some of the decision making is that there are always going to be bad actors, but to kind of make decisions based on these kind of Machiavellian plots that someone's going to go and do it all in one night, and that's just not right. I mean, we have things in place for those very situations, or even someone in practice to show that they are not competent. That's where we put in, our community to speak up and to say that. But to clump everybody by, these one or two experiences, not realizing that, a young parent or somebody who absorbs differently may do fine to take a certain amount of information, whatever their limit is at that point independently, is less valid than somebody who has the resources, the money, and the time to go to a conference, because part of the experience is not just going to class all day, but then also gabbing with your friends at the end of it. So I think as you look at learners and you look at generationally where we are, even where we are in our careers, we really have to revamp and kind of get with the times and understand that there's many different ways to do this and different ways to access it. And opening those doors are what removes barriers from us being able to practice competently, and to give this, to use that in our everyday lives with Californians. I think that when we take an approach, a very restrictive or inhibitive approach, it feels outdated. It feels archaic. And honestly, when it comes to our younger clinicians, that have learned in a different style, it feels very, they can't access it. It's very difficult for them, which is the opposite perhaps for me, who'd say I'd rather do it in person than online. It's a preference. But again, learners are, as vast and as different, as the hands on my finger. And that's my comment. I just wanted to share. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Any public comment? It looks like we're kind of interacting with public and board members at the same time, at least Karen, and so I guess it's okay to do that. Karen, did you want to say something?
I actually have one question. I don't know if Charisse or Paul can answer this. I'm looking at the chart, the spreadsheet chart in my packet, and it says self-study limitations. Like, for example, the dental board is 50%, the optometry board is 40% max, but then I see some that are none. Does that mean that they don't allow any self-study, or does that mean that there are no limitations, like they could do 100%?
Hi, Karen, this is Charisse. That means they can do all self-study, so there is no limitation. And so some of these are, of course, medical board, podiatric medical board, and some of them they're mostly doing the continuing medical education and their ACCME category. There's different categories and there's different ways. Some of the doctors also do ran rounds at their hospitals to get their CEs. Those end up being live, except for maybe in this last year. But
Right.
so there's quite a variety at the doctoral level for sure. And then differing levels. So like some of them allow 75% of self-study, some allow as little as 17%. And then you've got none. So
right, I see. I see that. And then for audiology, it's I see a number here. It's 12 hours total a year. Oh no. 12 of the it's 24 hours.
yeah, so the currently proposed changes are to offer 50%. That's what was approved back in 2016. And so that would be the 12 hours.
Okay. And then the other 12 hours would have to be synchronous.
Yes, interactive and synchronous.
Okay. I'm Marsha, I'm perfectly fine with the 50%. We started discussing this in 2016, obviously, and that was way before COVID. My other suggestion, though, would be what one of the commenters made was to, instead of saying a self-study course, then make it synchronous and asynchronous, just to make it make the definition clear throughout the board. Because I know, like with my child's education last year, they also did stuff like synchronous versus asynchronous.
I agree with that change. I think that's something we ought to really look into. I see that Board Counsel has their hand up. Michael?
Yes, good morning, Madam Chair. 2 points. I just wanted to confirm that because we are in the committee meeting, that only committee members can participate rather than board members. And also wanted to answer your question that it is okay. It's within the discretion of the committee chair as to whether to have the kind of back and forth discussion that you're having with members of the public. That is fine. It's within your discretion.
So board staff can participate, being not committee members, but they can participate. How do you classify the staff, board staff?
Certainly board staff can participate as well. That's your staff, and it's also within your discretion to ask them questions and have them participate.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if there are any further comments from the public about the 50%. When I look at that list of different boards, allied health boards and medical boards, it looks like some require something, some require nothing in terms of how many hours. So I don't know if we're trying to shift and change this current language to be less than 50% or more than 50% can be self-study or synchronous or asynchronous learning. Any further comment about keeping the 50% as it has been approved already, or changing that?
This is the moderator. I don't see any further requests for public comment, but if you'd like, we can wait a little bit to see if anyone wants to make a request for comment.
Okay, we can wait a little bit more. I don't know if Paul and Sharice have any further comment about the 50%.
Hi, Dr. Raggio. This is Paul. I just wanted to thank all the members of the public for their comment. And I think that, I want everybody to understand and be reminded that the board has taken into consideration all the various ways that people learn. I mean, many of our board members are educators, so I think we have a really good understanding of that. And we're trying to, balance that while also ensuring consumer protection. And it sounds like Karen already commented on the 50%. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Oh.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I apologize. This is the moderator. It appears there are no further requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you.
All right. The Q&A panel is now closed.
Okay, so I would say if there are any revisions at this point, it would be perhaps to write a new definition for self-study or live learning for that matter, so that we're using more modern terms of synchronous and asynchronous in our definitions, that'd be more helpful. I'm not coming away with a solid feeling about whether the 50% should remain or not. So I'm not sure what to tell board staff in that regard in terms of any other revisions that we might want to make. I am anxious to hear the counterpart of this conversation when the Speech Language Pathology Practice Committee comes up next, because I believe they will also be looking at this topic. Sharice, do you see there's anything more we need to say or decide at this point?
No, I don't think so. I think it's been a good conversation. We can look at making some potential proposed revisions for the self-study and bring it back to the Audiology Committee next time. And of course, listen into the SLP Practice Committee and see if your committee is in alignment with theirs, or if there's other action in the future needed to separate requirements.
Okay, Karen, I saw your mic on for a second. Do you want to say something more?
Yeah, just to make sure that to change the self-study to like asynchronous.
I have a note for that too,
Okay,
Karen.
great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, if there are not any further board comments, I would like to then adjourn the Audiology Practice Committee meeting and turn over the floor to the board's vice chair, Holly Kaiser, to continue with the Speech Language Pathology Practice Committee meeting. Hold on just one second. Does anybody feel like we should take a short bio break at this point, or can you go on?
I think it's a good idea that we take a break.
Okay, Holly, hopefully that's okay with you, maybe 10 minutes?
Yes, I totally agree. Thank you. So let's start at about 10:40. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, this is the moderator, and we will return back at 10:40.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay. Welcome, everyone. This is Holly Kaiser. I'm vice chair of the board, and this is the Speech Language Pathology and Practice Committee meeting. And I would like to do roll call first. Is our speech pathologist member, Gilda Dominguez. Are you here?
I am here.
Great.
Hello,
And our public member, Debbie Snow.
Yes, hi, I'm here.
Great. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to see if there's any public comments on items that are not on the agenda. So can you please open that up for comments?
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment for items not on the agenda, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests. All right, this is the moderator. Seeing no requests for public comment, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, the Q&A panel is now closed.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to be covering agenda item 3, the discussion and possible action regarding continuing professional development requirements as stated in Title 16 CCR sections 1399.160 through 1399.160.13 and Title 16 CCR section 1399.170.14. Some of you may have heard or joined the Audiology Practice Committee meeting, and we a lot of the same items were discussed in detail. So I realize that there may be some repetition here, but also I believe that discussion really enriched what we're going to be talking about. In November of 2015, the board approved revisions to the current continuing professional development requirements, and the revisions would allow up to half of the required CPD hours to be accrued through self-study. In May 2016, the board reviewed those regulations again and made additional changes. And so those are the proposed changes that we're going to be looking at. And I think this is worth repeating as well. The definition of self-study, we're going to be looking at that, and we'll be looking at the number of hours of self-study. And we'll be starting with the discussion among the board, which is Gilda, Debbie, and myself, but we will be opening this up to public comment as well. So under definitions, page 1 of 1399.160, A self-study course means a form of systematic learning that does not offer participatory interaction between the licensee and the instructor during the instructional period. These include, but are not limited to, recorded courses delivered via the internet or CD-ROM/DVD, correspondence or home study, in which require completing and passing an assessment or examination of the course content. And let's see. And then the other item I want to refer to is on page 3 under 1399.160.3. It's actually A1. No more than 12 of the 24 hours required hours by way of self-study. So again, that had been increased from 6 to 12 as of the last changes. So I do have a bias, and as we were all talking in the last meeting, based on my experience, and it's very positive. So I just want to put that out there, and we'll bring that up in this discussion a bit more. But since the time of these proposed regs, there's been considerable advancements in online self-study and online interactive live CE opportunities. Additionally, this issue has become more pronounced because of the COVID pandemic. Many professionals had relied on in-person continuing professional development that may now only be available through self-study. And the current limit of 6 self-study hours I have noted has caused great concern by a number of licensees that have contacted me towards meeting their CPD renewal requirements because of such limited opportunities. And so even the proposed language of the 12 of the 24 hours is considered to be quite restrictive by some. And the material that was provided to the board that shows what other boards have under the healing arts licensees have in their regs showed that 8 out of the 14 boards have no limitations on self-study. And just for example, this includes OT, PT, Board of Behavioral Sciences, physician's assistants, registered nurses, to name a few of those. There's been an increase in the amount of self-study hours available as a result of COVID. For example, the California Speech Language Hearing Associations, their conference last year was because of the cancellation due to COVID, that the most recent conference was virtual. But what that meant was that the courses could be taken synchronous. I'm not sure I'm using the word correctly, but you could do it live where you could interact, and you could also, as an option, see it asynchronous afterwards because they were pre-recorded. And so again, under the limits of the law as it stands right now, only 6 units could have been counted. However, of the ones that are asynchronous, that are pre-recorded. However, because those were available to everybody, the whole conference was available that way. It provided incredible flexibility and opportunity to take many more courses than they could have if they had only gone to a live event or only taken the live courses online. So with that as background, I'd like to open it up to Gilda and Debbie, and let's look at the questions that have been raised about the definition of self-study and the number of hours of self-study. Do you have any comments?
This is Gilda. I do. I do want to acknowledge the comment that was made earlier in the previous conversation regarding the CPD requirements, regarding the verbiage of synchronous / real time. I wanted to have further discussion on that verbiage that was proposed, because I do think it's important to align that term. Okay, are we going to use synchronous, or are we going to use real time? Are we going to use asynchronous versus recorded or pre-recorded? So I think that does need to be considered on the consistency of the language.
Mhm. Okay, thank you, Gilda. I would agree with that. And do you have any comments about the number of self-study units or the percentage?
I do also understand the concern that licensees are having regarding the availability of live courses. I also do acknowledge the previous comment regarding, the monetary barriers that can be imposed on people if they have to take time off, or they have to travel out of state potentially, or even out of their local area. But also having the convenience of being able to learn in the privacy or the silence of your own home or a designated area. And again, people do learn in different ways. There are preferences. So I think it would be good to consider that and give that flexibility.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on Debbie? I see your hand up, so I thought maybe you had a comment. Was that from before? No?
Debbie, you're still
Okay.
on mute.
Holly,
Hi.
this is Paul. I just wanted to point out that we're having a glitch with the raising of the hand. Mine keeps going
Oh.
up too, so I apologize for that.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yes, I just basically wanted to agree with you all that, for one, I do think it needs more concretely defined. And I do know, especially as we've learned during the pandemic, I do think it would be much easier to allow a lot more flexibility with self-study and online learning.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Debbie. I would like to open this up for public comment at this time.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. I'll go ahead and pause a moment to allow the public time to access the Q&A panel and submit their requests.
Oh, sorry. I see Miss. Oh, sorry. I thought somebody had raised their hand.
It does look like we have a raised hand.
We do.
So, Michelle, I'll request to unmute your microphone. When the prompt comes up, please click unmute me on your device. All right, Michelle, you are unmuted. Michelle, if you're speaking, it doesn't appear that your audio is coming through. I do see that you're logged in twice, so I'm going to try the second login and request to unmute that one, and hopefully that one works. So one moment.
Hello, this is Michelle Linares. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm the chair of the Speech and Hearing Association and California Speech and Hearing Association. I made public comment in the previous meeting, and so I apologize if it feels repetitive.
It appears that Michelle may have lost her connection. I'll try to keep an eye out for her in the attendee list, and when she comes back, I'll unmute her microphone again.
Okay, thank you.
All right, looks like she's back.
Okay.
It looks like she's back, so I'll have to request to unmute again. And Michelle, you are unmuted. Are you able to speak?
Hello? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, thank you. Okay. But I just want, I'm not sure where I was cut off. I apologize. But I just wanted to say that I think that updating ourselves and taking the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic and the way that we're able to access knowledge and still be able to have our continuing education be accessible to us by many different means, I think is really important at this day and age. And I think, to keep restricting it speaks to an old model or an old paradigm that is now shifting, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong, and it's wonderful to be able to go to convention or, or to a weekend long conference or a week long conference. But again, that presents barriers to younger, newer clinicians or other people that don't necessarily enjoy learning that way, or the financial barriers. I think that there's a big assumption that it's one thing to be able to pay for a course, it's another thing to take the time off to be able to do that. And again, the way that technology and the way that our younger learners or our multi-generational learners access information is far from what we're used to traditionally. And so I would go as far as saying that I think that we should remove all requirements of or restrictions against how many hours. As it stands, it's very prohibitive, right? It's very restrictive. And I think eliminating that would be able to let us better serve the public. Most of the speech language pathologists and audiologists that I've come to know really, practice at the top of their license and are doing the best that they can every day for Californians, And so again, we have things in place to stop bad actors from taking advantage of these systems. And if we need to come up with something that is that speaks to those issues directly from people's experiences, then we can do that. But I don't think that should be the thing that stops us from moving forward and making these changes, for as extreme as they may seem for some people to say that we should be able to do it all online or asynchronous. That shouldn't be frowned upon, because there are people that would prefer that, and those that prefer live will access it that way as well. I mean, there's 30,000 of us, and I think that within that within that amount of people, we're going to find everything across the spectrum in terms of what people prefer. I yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I want to say it's definitely worth repeating anything that was said in the Audiology Committee practice meeting that is relevant to this discussion. Some people may not have been on that meeting, so I appreciate all of your comments, Michelle. Are there any other public comments?
This is the moderator. I do not see any other raised hands or requests in the Q&A feature. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
All right, the Q&A feature is now closed.
So I have a question for one of the staff. Since we're going to be looking at this making a recommendation, and so is Audiology. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the impact on the timeline. The reason to get everything approved, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because, as for the time being, we still have a lot of restrictions in terms of not getting together in face-to-face synchronous CPD opportunities. The waiver that we asked for to take away the restrictions of self-study was not approved. So currently, we're still under the 6 hour self-study until we have new language that is approved. So can you comment at all about the impact of our decisions to make some changes, just so we kind of know the whole picture?
Yes, Holly. Hi, and I can also let Charisse chime in on this, since she kind of oversees our regulations rulemaking process. But we currently have approved language in place that is in the queue to be noticed publicly. I think that once we know if there are recommended changes, we'll have to work with the speech language pathology side and audiology side. Currently, the language that's proposed includes both speech language pathology and audiology. If those go in different directions, then we'll have to rewrite the language, determine what the language is, go over these definitions, and bring it back to the board for approval. So we're on a longer timeline if we go this route. If we decide to go forward with the current language, then I think we just recently hired someone to help us out in the regs area. Someone's who's going to be doing that full time. I think that we could probably get the current language on the fast track and probably see something within a year. If we go outside of that, then I think if we did that, I don't think that limits us. If we went forward with current language, I don't think that we are limited and have to stick with that. We can still continue talking about CPD and even self-study. So I think we have some options on the table, but I do think that there's some potential for prolonging this and having to live with the current restrictions a little bit longer. Do you have anything to add to that, Charisse?
No, I think you covered it very well. I think the biggest consideration is if it sounds like we're just tweaking the self-study definition and not going past the 50%, it doesn't sound like we need to split up as much. If there's a deviation from that by the two committees and the board approves that, we might need to separate out maybe some of the other sections that say how much self-study limitation is for the different professions, depending on what the board would ultimately decide based on both committees' recommendations.
Okay. I think that's very helpful, and I would propose that based on our discussions, I think we're already in alignment in terms of looking at the definition and updating it with language to include synchronous and asynchronous. So that I don't see that as a barrier. I think the number of hours, if we can talk about that at the entire board level, and look at what advantages there would be to come to an agreement there, I think in my opinion, would be a good idea. So is there any more comment from Gilda or from Debbie after hearing the public comments?
I just wanted to add that I appreciate the compilation of the document that includes the requirements for the CE-CPD requirements. Very informative and eye-opening. How you had mentioned initially that 8 out of the 14 listed didn't have any limitations regarding self-study. And you have about 3 of them that have over a 50% requirement or limitation. One has a 40% limitation, and then there are two that have a limitation that is equal to or less than 25%. So again, very informative and a great reference point for us to utilize. So we're not going in blindly on this discussion, this continued discussion. So again, I appreciate that. And also regarding the verbiage, regarding the definitions, and considering including real time when you're talking about the synchronous as well, along with that interaction with the presenter. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I think this brings us to a conclusion of this discussion. This is my first practice committee meeting. So, Sharice or Paul, can I just tell you what I feel the conclusions are in terms of the topics that we want to continue to discuss, or do you need a particular statement? What do you need at this point from me?
I think it would be helpful for you to just clarify where you think the committee is.
Okay. Okay. We would like to look at updating the self-study definition to discuss including the words synchronous and asynchronous as part of that discussion to clarify what self-study is. And the other point would be to consider the increasing the number of self-study hours from the proposed 12 hours.
Holly, your audio cut out. We can't hear
it did?
you. Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me
Yes.
now? Yes? Okay. Did you hear my first point about the definition?
Yes, and then you said consider increasing, and then it cut out.
Okay, and then on the number of self-study hours, we are recommending that we discuss the increasing from the 50%, also, or another way to say it, increasing from the 12 hours that have been proposed in the current proposed regs to a higher number. Did you hear all that?
Yep, I got it.
Okay, great. Okay, so I believe that concludes that discussion. I'd like to move on to the next item. And hold on one second. So item 3 in our agenda, I'm sorry, item 4, the discussion of possible action regarding maximum number of support personnel of speech language pathologists, as stated in Title 16 CCR Section 1399.170.16. Give me 1 second. Pull that up. Our board will consider the revisions to the speech language pathology assistant regulations. We at the February 21st, 2020 board meeting, the staff brought to the board the concern expressed in a written public comment about whether the regulation be changed to allow the part-time equivalence of this limitation. Oh, I'm sorry, I should state what it is currently. The California Code of Regulations, section 1399.170.16 states, a supervisor shall not supervise more than 3 support personnel, not more than 2 of which hold the title of speech language pathology assistant. Support personnel includes speech language pathology assistants and speech language pathology aides. So at the February 21st, 2020 board meeting, the staff brought up to the board a concern expressed in written public comment about whether the regulation be changed to allow the part-time equivalence of this limitation, as it limits SLPA's employment flexibility as the limitation limits SLPA's employment flexibility and their ability to juggle other educational life priorities. Many are still working on their master's degree, etc. But also, there have been so many, the need for SLPAs has never been greater, with a lot of compensatory therapy that needs to be provided in schools, for example. SLPAs are highly utilized in those situations. They're not increasing the caseload of the SLPs, but the workload of the SLPs is unmanageable. They can't possibly make up all the hours the students need, and still manage their regular caseload with ongoing needs. So that's just an example. So I believe it's a really good discussion to have to gather input for this. And I'd like to open it up to Gilda and to Debbie. And I know Gilda and I were invited to a phone meeting with some CASHA leaders, California Speech Language Hearing Association leaders. I could not attend. Gilda does have the information from that call. She was on it. So Gilda, could you share that information at this point?
Sure. So I was on a June 16th, 2021 call with some leaders from the California Speech Language and Hearing Association. And the same sentiment was echoed that you see here documented on the February 21st, 2020 board meeting. There were concerns that were presented regarding, first, the number of support personnel that are being supervised, and that there is no differentiation between full-time and part-time status of those support personnel, which again, having that limit of 2 is communicated as being a barrier to the SLPs who are supervising them, especially with the caseloads that they do have and the requirements of the, for example, the SLPAs. So they feel that with that limitation, that this limitation is not meeting the needs of the consumers. So the same sentiment was expressed, that the SLPAs also have other commitments as well, which foster this FTE of being part-time. So it would be beneficial to be able to look at the limitation of work status versus the number of support personnel that the speech language pathologists are guiding and mentoring and supervising.
Thank you very much, Gilda.
Sure.
Debbie, I see you raising your hand.
Yes, I defer a lot of this to both of you since you are in the profession, but is there a differentiation between what level of supervision they need in order to protect the public?
Well, the level of supervision that's in the regs right now is, I don't have that right in front of me. I believe it's 20% for the first 90 days. And it's, there's a lot of information defining how that is, how much is direct, et cetera.
Okay.
But yeah, after the first 90 days, from my review of it, I don't see anything more specific, although an SLP is always responsible for the caseload and the SLPA work serving that caseload.
Okay.
If that answers your question.
That helps. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to open this up to public comment. Oh, I'm sorry, Gilda.
Yeah, so the caseload must be manageable by that speech language pathologist. That support personnel cannot have their own in addition to the speech language pathologist. So that's one of the considerations.
Yeah, they're supposed to assist, to supplement. They're not supposed to have their own caseload. It's not supposed to increase the caseload. But like the example I gave, there's certainly workload in terms of frequency of students being seen that can increase, makeup time, etc. And Gilda, one thing I was wondering about is, do you have any comments about other settings? My background is school, so that was the example I gave.
Well, there's a challenge in the acute hospital setting. That's different than PT and OT. They're able to see certain populations and payer sources in which we are limited to do so.
Okay.
And we do not have outpatient pediatrics in the setting that we're at, but we do have, for example, a rehab unit where the PTs and the OTs, their assistants, are able to provide care. So we're not able to do that. So we are. That's a whole different conversation. We're limited there as well.
Okay. So I want to make sure I cover everything that Gilda and Debbie wanted to say. Are you two okay with me opening up to public comment now?
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Can we do that, please?
All right, this is the moderator and at the direction of the committee, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click that Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. It looks like I do also have a hand raised from Michelle. So Michelle, I'm going to request to unmute your microphone. Please click that unmute me button when the prompt comes up. Great, Michelle, and you are unmuted.
Okay, everybody. And you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'm in the private practice setting, and a lot of private practice owners, the restrictions that we have is, to employ Californians. It's difficult, especially when a large majority are some students that are trying to get into the profession or into graduate school, and they can't. We know that there's obstacles to that pipeline, and so there are many SLPAs that will be career SLPAs. When we look to hire them, I can't tell you how many times it's been difficult to have a good candidate that you're ready to employ, and you don't have a supervisor with an open license. That symbiotic relationship it can turn into one that is very uncomfortable and difficult, because it's really reliant that supervisor stay at that practice. We've had them go on maternity leave. We've had people retire. We've had people pass away. You have to scramble for 30 days then to find yet another employee that is an SLP that would be willing to supervise the 2 or 3 that are left in your practice. And that makes it really unreasonable. Again, the idea of part-time and full-time, that's another issue that we find. If you're going to have an open license, you'd rather a full-time employee than a part-time employee. There are some SLPAs that work in multiple settings, and it doesn't allow them to moonlight, to be in one or the other, again, because of the restriction of hours. It doesn't always make fiscal sense to have somebody there for part-time. You're paying a soup to do that, and then they're unable to really bring in from a financial standpoint, to break even all of those hours that it takes to supervise them and to pay for what they're able to produce in terms of productivity. And also with the shortage, in private practice, there are so many children, Californians, that go unseen, especially in that 0 to 3 population. And I know that in school age at the schools, we also have those issues as well, because we don't have enough clinicians to be able to go out there. So we've created a workforce by allowing SLPAs to exist, and then we're unable to employ all of them if they come through our doors asking for a job. The other thing that I take a big issue with is that these restrictions aren't true of OT and PT. They're able to determine as professionals how many people they want to supervise or not. So why is it okay for them to be able to practice that way to Californians, and that's not an issue or a problem for consumers, but on the speech side, it's been raised as though that could be a potential problem. It seems hypocritical there. So aside from the inability to be able to employ them, or then when you do have them employed, keep them employed with a guarantee that you'll have a supervisor for them in case the supervisor leaves. Also, those that are going to be career SLPAs and have no plans to go on to be SLPs, that also creates barriers in terms of their supervision and the type of supervisions that they need versus somebody who just is fresh out and has those 90 days. And again, the way that we treat SLPAs, because they seem to be newer than an OTA or a certified OTA or a PTA, there seems that there isn't fidelity across the board, where one discipline acknowledges and respects that assistant, and because we don't have it written in our regs, yet we continue to produce them, but we don't have anything to truly support their ability to work. So again, across the board, it impacts Californians in the workforce, especially that, like in my case and in many of our cases, we employ mostly women of childbearing age, women of a young age trying to, take those different steps in those careers or make those decisions, and then again, the fact that we have a shortage, that we're not even able to meet the need of Californians that need speech and language pathology services. And here we have an assistant level that can help us, start to close that gap. And yet we make it even harder for them to be able to do that. And when we go to pay sources and we talk about things like Medicare, also acknowledging PTAs or OTAs, but not SLPAs, just because it wasn't written in the language, that just seems like a gross misjustice and something that needs to be rectified immediately. If we're talking about a simple language change, we took up that heavy lift with Title 17 just to add SLIPA into the regulations, and we still have yet to see the language actually written in there, even though it was approved. And so these kind of bureaucratic, red tape situations that we find ourselves in, again, impact Californians at the end of the day. We see them, go without service all the time. And, just all across the board, this is something that needs to be looked at, because I think that that when SLIPA and the regulations were created for them, maybe identified or envisioned a certain setting or a certain type of person with a different career trajectory. And what we find now is that we have an influx, a surplus of this workforce that, it seems unethical to keep allowing them to make SLIPAs if we're not going to be able to give them true employment, or consistent or stable employment, and charging them all the money to go through those programs. Anyhow, I yield my time.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'm going back to Debbie's question, which I think was a really good one about the level of supervision, because, and I just answered it just just about, yes, they have to be supervised. However, when I think about, we're looking at possibly recommending an increase the number of SLPAs that could be supervised by one SLP. I'd like to bring up the question about, do you think it should be considered how much experience they have, that the SLPA has? So if they're in their first 90 days, should it be more restrictive in terms of how many SLPAs you can supervise at that level versus one that's had 4 or 5 years experience? Any thoughts about that? I see Michelle raised her hand.
I apologize. Let me request to unmute her again. And Michelle, you are unmuted.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to speak to that, because again, we, at least at Learning Grove and at many of my counterparts down here in Southern California, that we are training sites for SLPAs. for graduate students and for externs, it's interesting to see the different levels, right? Definitely when someone is new and green, they're going to need support, supervision. But there have been plenty of times that I have career SLPAs that could dance circles in terms of therapy, in some that you would consider higher licensed, a newer person just out of their CF. And yet you have an SLPA that's been practicing, for 10, 12 years. It's true, very, very much so, that they are able to do other tasks administratively, and things that are within their scope, but that don't need that level of supervision. And it could be done safely. And I in all my years that I have seen different SLPAs at different levels of their career, I would say that the supervision requirements have been good for those newer ones, and we make adjustments, but sometimes those supervision requirements have definitely been a huge barrier for those more experienced career level SLPAs that I'm not sure if we anticipated way back when in the inception of this. So definitely, I think tiered supervision is something different. Also across settings, most of our clinicians that come out with 425 hours under their belt from graduate school have vast experience in early intervention pediatrics that might look different from an SLP in the hospital. And I have had the pleasure of working side by side with SLPAs in the hospital that are so incredibly skilled at a much higher level. In just their experience and because of the setting and the exposure that they've had, so that is another huge consideration to really take a look at, instead of clumping them into, this one kind of box and saying, well, 90 days, you need this much. And then after that, then we'll determine what you need. It's so different when you look at the skill level. And as a professional, as a licensed professional, I feel that I am able to determine that as I have experience or interaction with my employee or with that slip, that I could say, I think that this is where you need continued education or more help, or this is where you are just excellent and you bring so much to the table. So again, this isn't something that they come out not being able experience to do. I don't think that we're talking about any kind of SLPA that is working with a medically fragile patient, and arguably some would tell me there are SLPAs that work in tandem with their SLP to do PO trials and whatnot, under direct supervision. So this question of supervision, I think, should be looked at based on the activity, looked at the setting, and how long they've been in the profession. Before we make comments about restricting them just because they're not considered fully licensed like an SLP that went to graduate school. I yield my time.
Thank you, Michelle. Any other public comment?
This is the moderator. I don't see any further requests for public comment in the Q&A or raised hands. Would you like me to close that Q&A?
Yes, thank you.
All right, the Q&A feature is now closed.
So I think my remaining question would be for staff, and because we're trying to balance a very high quality standard of care, but also keep in mind making sure that we actually can have enough people to work with our consumers. And so if we look at not only the number that could be changed of SLP assistants being supervised to include perhaps part-time and into this formula, if we also look at their settings, their experience level, I'm just wondering the feasibility of that in terms of enforcement, I guess.
I think part of it is determining if there is if there's a specific limit that there needs to be, or if it's always on a case-by-case basis. And so oftentimes when we're looking at regulatory language, we can talk about a cap or a cap and its equivalent when we're talking about part-time. When we're talking about experience level, that might be a little harder to implement. I'm trying to think on the fly about how that might work. But I know in our discussions tomorrow on the rest of the SLIPA regs that one of the questions we are bringing to the board is about that first 90 days of supervision and whether or not seasoned SLIPAs really need that level at that level for that long, kind of a question. I wanted to bring Paul in as well, but I think some of this might be a need for definition and clarity. Right now, it's pretty restrictive, right? So it's 3 support personnel and only 2 can be SLIPAs, and it doesn't matter if they're part-time or not. And is there a consumer protection concern if there's no limits at all? And that could be also problematic. I could see if there's 0 limits, like in there.
Right. If I could add to that too,
Yeah.
I think that sometimes I hear the comments from the audience, and I want to make it really clear that this is not about restricting. The question here is about actually removing barriers if that's a possibility. So I think what we're trying to really understand is we have heard some feedback from licensees that this can be restrictive. So we want to find out if this is a direction, this is a recommendation that the committee wants to make about increasing the number of support personnel. I think when these regulations were written, they were written this way for a reason. They were told that there's a maximum of 3 personnel, of which 2 can be SLIPAs, because they were considering that the SLIPA, how many personnel the SLIPA could actually supervise. So is this too restrictive? Should we consider increasing that number? And I think if we do consider increasing that number, we have to be careful not to make it so that it does create an enforcement workload. We're talking about the different intricacies of hours involved. I do want to mention that we do have enforcement issues with SLIPAs working kind of outside of their scope or even being unlicensed. So this is something that I think we really need to think about thoughtfully, but we do understand that there are barriers that we might also want to consider, barriers in employment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Paul and Sharice. I think that I just would like to throw out my thoughts about this and again ask Debbie and Gilda if they have any more comments, because I think we've heard everything from the public now. I did get some input in gathering information on this topic, and one of the some of the feedback I was given made me come to the conclusion that if we increase it, I would like to see part-time allowed, and but still limit this so it's not just completely open-ended, because I think there'd be a lot more to consider if we do that. But one example would be having up to 4 SLPAs if you have part-time, and part-time meaning up to 20 hours a week. So, looking at some of that language. Debbie and Gilda, do you have any kind of final conclusions before we close this discussion?
So this is Gilda. I do agree that I think we should consider full-time equivalents, so the FTE equivalents. I know OT considers full-time equivalents in their supervision limits. I do believe they have no more than, for example, 4 OT assistants that can be supervised by a OT. So it'd be worth looking at what the other just as we did with the CPD requirements, CE requirements, what the other disciplines are following regarding the guidance and limitations for the supervision of the support personnel.
Thank you.
This is
I
Paul.
agree
Can I
with
ask a
that.
question? Gilda, are we saying then that I think the full-time equivalence question is really important because that's what regulations are for, you know, to define these types of things. So are we saying that you're looking at as many as 4, but they can only add up to a full-time equivalent of 2 SLPAs? Is that what you're saying?
So considering adding that up to maybe 4, the equivalent of 4 full-time equivalent roles. So you can have, this is just up for discussion. So maybe two part-times, and then the residual can be full-timers, but not exceeding 4 or said number FTEs. So if you have someone who works part-time and you have 2 of them, that would be equivalent to say 1. So you can have 3 full-timers and 2 part-timers.
So Gilda,
right?
you're recommending not only, I'm sorry, you're recommending not only that we consider FTE equivalents, but also increasing the number from the 2 FTE to 4 FTE. That's what I heard you say.
Yes, up for discussion, yes.
Right, up for discussion. Okay. I'd like to hear from Debbie. I see your hand raised.
Hi. It does sound like we need to increase so that more people can be helped. But I know also, like Paul said, during the time on the board here, there has been a lot of problems with working out of the scope of practice, and schools that hire and like wanting them to do the work of the SLP when they aren't qualified. So yeah, I think there'll need to be more discussion so that doesn't happen.
Or
Thank you.
maybe
Very-
sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add that I think the original problem came up because we were approached that by others that said that the problem was with flexibility. You know, I think so. We have 2 questions: is one, increase the flexibility so that we have multiple personnel that would equate to 2 full-time equivalents that are SLPAs. So it's 3 of which 2 can be SLPAs. So then the multiple personnel would equate to 2. That's one option. And then I'm hearing the second suggestion is to actually increase the number of personnel that can be supervised. So going beyond the current amount that's 3. But I think originally what we were hearing was this was an issue of flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Charisse. The other concern was also whether or not it's 3 support personnel, only 2 of which can be SLPAs. And does the flexibility increase at all if we aren't going to say that it's just 3 support personnel, whether it's a SLPA or an aide, you get 3 or whatever that number is. So there's kind of the 2 sides of the coin there is, especially if, because I don't know in the field how often speech language pathology aides are used versus SLPAs at this point. As from my understanding, the field has shifted quite a bit more to SLPAs and less to aides.
That is what I understand as well, Charisse. Any other comment about that? About that SLPAs are being much more utilized than aides?
I think so. This is Gilda. I just wanted to add, especially with Paul's comment. So yes, having the 3 support personnel and then allowing for flexibility. So keeping it at 3 would be good too, but also considering the FTE requirement or status of those support personnel to be considered, and how many contribute to that FTE number, whether that be, let's say at 3, right? 3 FTE of support personnel, or also looking at maybe, do you want to increase it to 4? But I think in this discussion, having 3 FTE support personnel could be considered.
I agree. I
And
think
not
that
increasing
kind of
it to
combines.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's basically suggesting we'd be removing the language, which is not more than 2 of which hold the title of SLPA, and then adding language regarding FTE equivalent. And of course, we can still discuss this in more depth later in terms of if that's the our final conclusion. But I'd say at this point, that's what I'd say it's those 2 points in FTE, and then removing the language about the aides.
That's because hindsight, if we're looking at increasing it to 4 FTE, that could be quite a lot of people. And if we're already having concerns regarding people working out of scope of practice. So as I reel that back, I think if you do 4 FTE, that I'm writing this down, like I could be a handful or more of people in different areas that are working, and you have the ethical responsibility to make sure that they are doing what they are supposed to do within their scope.
Yes. So I think that our recommendation is that we look at adding the FTE equivalent and removing the restriction of not more than 2 of which hold the title of speech language pathology assistant. So I don't, unless there's any more comments, I think that would conclude our discussion.
Holly, I just had one point of clarification. Earlier, you actually suggested a number of hours for that full-time equivalent, or for what the part-time.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, Paul, because I should have said this, that you could end up with like 5 FTEs, somebody each doing 1 day to equal one day each to equal 1 FTE. And I think that would be a nightmare and would not make sense. So my suggestion, when I gave my example, the suggestion was an FTE being half-time. And if they work less, then they still count as 1 slot. It's kind of the way I was thinking, up to half-time, but not to divide it into smaller increments, because I think, again, that would be very hard to manage the supervision. So we should probably discuss that point.
I think in talking to Charisse, she had some suggestions too, as far as the number of personnel that could equate to a full-time equivalent. Did you have that, Charisse, or am I imagining that?
No, I think my thought was right along with Holly's, is that it would be increasingly difficult for board staff if we were doing you could supervise 1 person 1 day a week, so that could be 5 part-timers equals 1 full-timer, and that's logistically hard to manage. Although I get where the desire for flexibility is, I do think it's clear, and it's easier to implement and enforce if we have an actual, if it's 2 part-times equal 1 full-time equivalent, great. If it's 3 part-time can equal 1 full-time equivalent. I just think it's cleaner if we kind of spell it out.
I see also we have a public comment from Michelle.
Michelle, I'm going to request to unmute your microphone. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt comes up. Right, Michelle, you are unmuted.
Thank you. I just wanted to bring up the point that when we're talking about like EDD and the way that we set up our job descriptions, is that in order for you to have benefits, you have to work 30 hours, but it's a 40-hour, work week. And anything under 30, like 29 hours and below, is considered part-time. And so I think that, when we're talking about somebody that you're restricting to only working 20 hours, this splitting hair, that this idea of clarity, there has to be some fidelity with the way that we actually hire people and the way that the labor board considers what part-time and full-time is in a practice, versus what the board is saying, which is going to change what that definition is, because there does come, in question benefits and whatnot that we have to provide our employees, and at what point are they considered full-time, at what point are they really considered part-time, according to what California says. The other is that, in terms of public safety, when we look at our counterparts in physical therapy and occupational therapy, they might have insight or metrics to help shape our guidance or recommendations for this. Because again, if it's not found that Californians are in danger, and we have PTs that are able to do that across the board, it almost feels discriminatory for SLP. So why are we any different, just because we're newer and we have more restrictions? So again, this idea of making, having decision making that that is consistent with what we apply to other disciplines, I think is also something to consider. And I would say my last point, and now it's escaping me. So we talked about public safety. I talked about part-time and full-time. Oh, the other one is, when we talk about levels of experience or, supervision, your employment is contingent on someone else signing off on you. That is a real huge issue across the board for employment settings, where you have, people working, and all of a sudden you say to them, you can't work anymore because we need to hire someone else yesterday. And I can tell you that we seem to have a lot more SLPAs sometimes than we do SLPs willing to change or that are coming in to apply for employment in certain practice settings. So the fact that we are limiting our ability to employ people or to keep them employed, that is also an issue that from a labor board standpoint, needs to be taken up. Because again, how do you offer someone that kind of instability and expect to be able to see these careers kind of flourish or progress into something different? Because not every SLPA has the desire to become an SLP. There are people that will stop at that point and are happy to just treat. So again, I understand that there are enforcement issues. I understand that, we do need to talk about, people practicing out of their scope. But if we're only making decisions on a select few that have disciplinary issues and not looking at the 30,000 of us to see what is actually going on, I think we're being short-sighted. And I really encourage you and please to take up this ability to be able to offer someone employment without the fear that they may not be able to continue working from one week to the next because their supervisor left. I yield my time.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. I think part of the recommended discussion should be defining how an FTE could be divided. So, the point of making enough hours, 29 or 30, for example, in order to qualify for benefits, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that should be part of the discussion. But again, being careful that, this is something that is feasible in terms of the supervision and enforcement by the board. And I also agree that looking at what other disciplines are doing is a good idea in the discussion. So I would like to add that to our recommendations.
Holly, can I just clarify something? I think that
Of course.
I think that what we're talking about again is expanding and becoming less restrictive. An employer has every option of making someone full-time or part-time, but I think for the purposes of this discussion, if we could kind of focus on what a full-time equivalent is so that we are able to write regulations that will go through the Office of Administrative Law and be successful from that standpoint, I do think that we need that,
Well, so-
that clarification of what is the number of personnel
Right.
that we're suggesting, and then defining full-time equivalent, right? I think that's where we are.
Right, I agree. So, I mean, it could be that if we go over 20 hours, for example, which would typically be half-time, but that one person is needing 29 hours, does that take up a whole slot? Or, you know, I think that we need to look at how that plays out. Can we leave it at that we will be looking at defining how FTEs would be broken up, you know, what an equivalent is, how many people that can be, and the number of total slots, and look at other disciplines in that discussion.
Yes, so I think going on Gilda's suggestion, if we base our what we bring back to the committee on that, I think we have something to move forward with.
Mm-hmm. Agree. If there's no other comments, I feel that concludes our discussion. So anything else from anybody? No? So I'd like to close the speech language pathology practice committee meeting. Thank you for all of your feedback, input.
Okay, I think we're going to go right into our full board meeting. Dr. Raja, do we want to take a break right now and then start up again?
I don't know. Do we want to go 10 minutes? Break for 10, or does everybody want to? What we were planning to do is shoot for lunchtime, approximately 12:30. So that gives us about 45 minutes, 40 minutes to cover a few more issues since we have such a full agenda. So I would prefer to keep going, but I will entertain the idea of taking a short break if people would like to.
Okay, so I say we take a short break then, and we'll start. We'll reconvene here at 12 noon.
12 o'clock. Okay. Okay, we'll meet back at 12.
All right, this is the moderator, and we will return at 12.